Throughout 2019, 2020, and early 2021, a series of political unrest known as the estallido social swept across the Latin American nation of Chile. The protests originated in the Chilean capital of Santiago and would eventually grow to encompass the entire country. There are a multitude of factors that explain the recent unrest, from city subway fares to ineffective national policies. And in this video, we will examine the factors and decisions that resulted in the current state of chaos and violence in this particular South American country. To understand the current political situation, it helps to go back a few decades. In 1970, a popular Marxist named Salvador Allende was elected president, who was a prominent member of Chile's Socialist Party. Almost immediately, he began the process of nationalization, where the government seizes control of certain sectors such as banking and mining. He expanded welfare systems, particularly pensions, and raised wages of government workers. In the short run, his reforms caused the economy to grow and unemployment to fall. But government expropriation of private property, protectionist policies, and price controls caused everything to come crashing down in 1972. It certainly didn't help that the United States, which was always anti-communist, had imposed harsh sanctions and spread fake propaganda that sowed the seeds of dissent within the country. What happened next is often omitted in US history textbooks. The CIA intervened on a democratically elected government by backing a coup led by the Chilean military. Allende was deposed as the elected president and was replaced by a dictator named Augusto Pinochet, who committed some brutal human rights violations in his first years of office. The new government began a reversal of Allende's previous economic policies through liberalization and privatization, which are the core tenets of capitalism. The government removed tariffs, which are taxes on imports and exports, allowing Chile to trade freely with other countries and domestic businesses to expand into foreign markets. Privatization of businesses, which is the act of government handing over ownership of businesses back to the people, spurred competition and created incentives for efficiency. Regulations were swept aside to make starting businesses easier, and what happened next is often known as the miracle of Chile. From 1984 to 1990, the Chilean GDP grew at nearly 6% every single year, the fastest of any Latin American country. Hundreds of thousands of people were lifted out of poverty. The country was completely transformed within a decade. Chile went from a destitute country with 45% of its population living in poverty to the most developed country in Latin America. New constitutional laws were imposed, making Chile back into a democracy in 1989, and the future was looking brighter than ever. As Chile's economy began to slow in the early 2000s, Pinochet's reforms began to lose momentum. The economic boom of the 1990s was not experienced equally by all citizens. The fundamental root of Chilean protests today can be explained by the social inequalities stemming from the liberalization fervor of the 1990s. Chile is now the most unequal country in Latin America. The richest 5% of the country controls 830 times more wealth than the bottom 5%. And the rich use their unprecedented control over Chile's money supply to lobby and bribe politicians into obstructing any legislation that threatens the current power structure. This economic structure has been heating the tension between social classes for years, and it reached a boiling point on October of 2019. The government raised metro fares by 30 pesos in the city of Santiago, which is the equivalent of 4 pennies. This really touched a nerve among Santiago's working class, many of whom take the metro to work. Chile already has one of the most expensive transit rates in the world, and what started with high school students calling for citizens to not pay the metro fee quickly expanded into including ordinary citizens of Santiago. On October 25th of that year, 1.2 million people flooded the streets of Santiago to protest the government's recent price hikes. Things escalated pretty quickly after that. Protesters burned down 19 subway stations, forcing the subway system to close. Ironically, these protest measures likely did more harm than good for Santiago's poor, many of whom depend on the subway system to commute. A few protesters also looted houses and shops, vandalized public areas, and shattered windows. In response, the current president named Piñera declared a state of emergency, which temporarily suspended the freedoms of the Chilean people. Military forces were deployed in civilian areas and curfews were put in place. What happened next was a series of violent encounters between police and demonstrators. 20 people died from the unrest and more than 2,500 demonstrators were arrested. Now people are calling for Piñera to step down as president. Piñera has since offered a few concessions such as an increase to minimum wage and pensions, but many protesters still view these measures as insufficient. Soon, protests erupted all over the country, pushing back against the rampant inequality. The privatization of pensions and healthcare were some of the major causes of tension. Take the healthcare system, for example. In the 1980s, the Chilean government created a dual system of healthcare that mixed public and private insurance. For the citizens who could afford the hefty private healthcare costs, the system was pretty good. But for 80% of the population covered by the underfunded government system, treatment could take months to receive. In fact, 10,000 citizens died waiting for operation in the first half of 2018 alone. Perhaps an even larger point of grievance is the pension system. In 1981, the Chilean government privatized the pension system. Pensions would be controlled by private companies instead of the government. These private companies were known as the Administradoras de Fondos de Pensiones, or the AFP. Workers would pay 10% of their income to the AFP, and the AFP would invest those funds and pay out pensions once the worker hits retirement age. Initially, this system was a huge success. The old government-controlled pension system relied on taxing young workers to pay retired citizens, a system plagued with bureaucracy and corruption. Funds were often misallocated into the pockets of corrupt officials. The new privatized system also allowed flexibility to work hours and adjusted payments for inflation. After workers paid their pension deposits, the AFP would take the money and invest it elsewhere to generate further revenue. In fact, 70% of pension payments handed back to retired workers were generated by the investments made by the AFP. Consequently, payout was 41% higher after the AFP than before. But three things would change everything. First was the informal economy. As the economy began to slow in the early 2000s, many workers found a shortage of formal jobs. A growing number of citizens partake in the informal economy, working jobs that don't provide much social benefits and are unregulated by the government. These are jobs that lack formal contracts and mainly rely on verbal agreements for payments. These jobs include drivers, handymen, freelance programmers, street performers, lemonade stand operators, etc. These informal jobs don't pay contributions to the pension funds, causing thousands of Chileans to go without savings. Second is longer life expectancy. As Chile became a developed nation, its life expectancy shot up from 62 years in 1970 to 80 years in 2019. People are living longer and require more pension payments. However, the retirement age stayed at 65 years, so people have the same amount of money saved for pensions, but more years that require payment. As a result, pension payments are below minimum wage and are simply insufficient to retire comfortably. Third is, I'm sure we all have heard of it, COVID-19. As citizens were stuck at home due to quarantine, they needed money for things such as food, water, utilities, rent, health insurance, auto insurance, phone data plans, you get the point. But instead of passing a larger stimulus bill financed by the government, the conservative government allowed citizens to withdraw a portion of their pension funds. Basically, the government said, hey everyone, you can now spend your own savings. And this happened a total of 3 times, causing the AFP to lose around $30 billion. And as a result, a third of Chile's pensioners now don't have any retirement savings. people eventually rallied around one demand: creating a new constitution. Congress passed a referendum asking the people of Chile if they wanted a new constitution, and despite the pandemic, millions of Chileans came out to vote overwhelmingly in favor for a new constitution drafted by elected representatives. Fast forward to May of this year. Representatives were elected to be part of the Constitutional Convention to create a new constitution that addresses the concerns of the protesters. Elections for mayors, governors, and city council members were also up for grabs. And across the country, left-leaning officials were elected into positions of power who promised to dampen the social inequalities. As of now, legislators are still trying to draft a new constitution and pass new bills in attempts to form a more egalitarian society for the Chilean people. But until drastic reforms are passed, the Chilean people will continue to suffer under an asymmetric power dynamic that hampers social mobility and facilitates the exploitation of the working class by the wealthiest citizens. Chile is a story of how rapid privatization and liberalization of businesses, the core tenets of capitalism, can completely transform a nation within a decade. But this completely laissez-faire or hands-free approach taken by the government during the transition phase results in unbridled inequality. And many Chileans still don't feel their share of the miracle of Chile today. This issue isn't unique to just Chile. Across the developed world, income inequality is increasing at an alarming rate, creating a time bomb that one day might also explode.